Richard stood at the expansive windows of his mansion, a luxurious fortress of polished marble and shimmering glass that overlooked the sprawling green of Maplewood Park. The sun bathed the landscape in a golden hue, and he could see the vibrant colors of blooming flowers dancing in the gentle breeze. Yet, despite the picturesque view, a cloud of unease overshadowed his heart. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging up a small section, and watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension as his son, Jake, and his girlfriend Emily strolled hand in hand along the winding paths of the park. Jake was laughing, a sound that usually filled Richard with pride, but today it came with a tinge of worry. He observed how Emily's laughter sparkled like the sunlight, her eyes bright with joy as she listened to Jake's stories. She was beautiful, no doubt, her long chestnut hair cascading over her shoulders, her skin glowing as if kissed by the sun. Yet, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that her affections for Jake might be intertwined with their family's wealth. He'd seen it before. The allure of money could twist even the purest intentions. "Dad, are you coming?" Jake's voice echoed from the living room, pulling Richard from his thoughts. He turned away from the window, moving into the lavishly decorated space where Jake was gathering his things, ready for a picnic. "Just a moment," Richard replied, forcing a smile. He needed to keep his composure, not let his son see the worry etched on his face. After all, Jake was oblivious to the concerns haunting his father's mind. Richard admired Emily, but he needed to know if she was truly the right choice for his son. He had plans, a test of sorts, that would help him uncover the truth about her character. As they left for the park, Richard's thoughts spiraled into a whirlwind of possible scenarios. He recalled overhearing a conversation between Jake and Emily just a few days prior, during which Emily had mentioned her love for the finer things in life. The way she spoke, with an air of entitlement, had unsettled him. "What do you think of the new restaurant downtown?" she had asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I heard it's the most exclusive place in the city. Maybe we could go there this weekend?" Jake's response had been enthusiastic, but Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he wanted his son to find someone who appreciated hard work, not someone who simply wanted the perks of a wealthy lifestyle. As Richard paced the marble floors of his mansion, he decided it was time to take action. He would test Emily's character. A plan began to form in his mind, one that would require him to step outside his comfort zone and into a world he had long avoided, the world of the less fortunate. He envisioned himself as a homeless man, a character who would allow him to observe Emily without her knowing who he really was. Later that evening, Richard went into his study, where he meticulously crafted his disguise. He rummaged through the back of his closet, retrieving old clothes that he hadn't worn in years, frayed jeans, a tattered jacket, and a worn-out beanie. He even found an old pair of shoes that looked as if they had seen better days. As he gathered the items, he felt a strange thrill coursing through him, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. The next step was crucial. He needed to make himself appear authentic. Richard carefully applied fake dirt to his face and hands, the gritty texture giving him an unsettling sense of realism. He practiced his new persona in the bathroom mirror, trying to channel the weariness and despair that came with living on the streets. "Charlie," he whispered to himself, nodding as he spoke the name of his alter ego. "You're Charlie now." With a deep breath, Richard stepped out of his mansion, the world outside feeling foreign and daunting. As he walked toward Maplewood Park, he felt the weight of his privilege pressing down on him. The streets were alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter, but they felt distant, like echoes from another life. He could hear the joyous sounds of families enjoying their evenings, unaware of the struggles faced by those less fortunate. When Richard finally arrived at the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. He found a secluded spot near a cluster of trees where he could keep an eye on Jake and Emily without being seen. Richard settled onto a bench, the rough wood pressing against his back, a stark contrast to the plush seats of his home. Minutes passed, and he soon spotted Jake and Emily making their way to a small clearing, a picnic basket swinging from Jake's arm. Richard's heart raced as he watched them spread out a blanket, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves above. Jake opened the basket, revealing an array of delectable treats, freshly made sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of sparkling water. "Look at this sandwich, Em," Jake exclaimed, holding up a particularly large one. "I think I might have outdone myself this time." Emily giggled, leaning closer to Jake. "You always do. I'm pretty sure you could give those gourmet chefs a run for their money," she teased, her voice light and playful. Richard's stomach twisted at the sight. It was a simple moment, but it was one filled with warmth and affection. He wanted to believe that Emily was the right person for Jake, but doubt gnawed at him. Would she care for Jake if he was struggling, if the riches disappeared overnight? As he watched them, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the life he had left behind. He ignored it, unwilling to let the distractions of his reality pull him away from this important moment. Instead, he focused on Emily, her laughter ringing out like a melody, captivating him. It was easy to see why Jake was smitten. "Let's take a picture," Emily suggested, pulling out her phone. "We need to capture this moment." "Sure, let's do it," Jake replied, excitement lighting up his face. They posed together, arms around each other, and Richard felt a pang of longing, a wish that he could be as carefree as they appeared. He couldn't help but wonder if Emily's affections were genuine or merely a reflection of Jake's status. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, Richard felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. He was about to embark on a journey he had never imagined, one that would see him entwined in a web of deception. But it was for Jake's sake, he reminded himself. He needed to protect his son's heart, to ensure he wasn't blinded by love for someone who might not have his best interests at heart. With one last glance at the couple, Richard steeled himself for what lay ahead. He had a plan, and he was determined to see it through, no matter how uncomfortable the path might become. As he sat on that bench, the world around him faded, and all he could focus on was the impending challenge of uncovering the truth about Emily, one encounter at a time. As Richard sat on a weathered bench in the park, his heart raced with anticipation. Dressed in tattered clothes, he had transformed into Charlie, a scruffy figure blending into the backdrop of the vibrant afternoon. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground, but Richard's focus remained on his son, Jake, and his girlfriend, Emily. They had spread a checkered blanket under a blossoming cherry tree, laughter mingling with the soft rustle of the leaves. Emily, radiant and animated, had a way of drawing people in. Richard watched as she carefully unpacked a picnic basket, the contents spilling out: gourmet sandwiches, fresh fruit, and an assortment of snacks. She placed everything with precision, each item seemingly chosen with love, and Richard felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Perhaps this young woman, so full of life and generosity, was the right match for Jake after all. "Here, I made your favorite," Emily said, her voice lilting like a melody. She handed Jake a sandwich, her eyes sparkling with affection. Jake grinned, taking a big bite. "You always know what I like, Em. You're amazing." He reached out to squeeze her hand, and Richard felt a pang of nostalgia. The bond between them was palpable, a connection that he had hoped would be genuine. But the spectre of wealth loomed large in Richard's mind, clouding his judgment. As the couple shared their meal, Richard leaned forward, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. Laughter erupted between them, and for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a future where Emily was part of their family. She seemed so caring, so attentive, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was indeed the compassionate soul he desperately wanted her to be. "Do you remember that time we went to the beach?" Emily asked, her voice filled with warmth. "You tried to build that giant sandcastle, and it just collapsed." Jake chuckled, a playful glint in his eye. "Hey, I was just trying to impress you. I'll have you know I'm an expert at building castles now." Richard's heart swelled with a mix of pride and concern. He had raised Jake to be a good man, but the world of privilege they inhabited was fraught with complexities. Wealth had a way of distorting perceptions, and Richard feared that Emily's affection could be influenced by Jake's status. Just as their laughter faded, Richard knew it was time to make his presence known. He stood up from the bench, brushing imaginary dirt from his clothes, and shuffled toward them, adopting a slouched posture. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back one last time at the comfort of his previous life before taking a deep breath and approaching. "Excuse me, sir and madam," he mumbled, his voice gravelly. "Could you spare some change? Just a little to help a man get by?" Emily turned, her expression shifting from surprise to concern almost instantly. "Oh my gosh!" she exclaimed softly, her eyes widening as she took in Richard's disheveled appearance. "Are you okay?" Richard felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "I'm just trying to get by, miss. Any little bit would help." Instead of reaching for her wallet, Emily's gaze softened. "You must be hungry. Here, take this." She reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a sandwich, carefully wrapping it in a napkin before extending it toward him. "Please, it's fresh. I made it this morning." Richard was taken aback. This was not the response he had expected. He had anticipated a hesitant exchange, perhaps a fleeting moment of pity. But here she was, offering food instead of money, her kindness radiating in the afternoon sun. "Thank you, miss," he said, struggling to mask the surprise in his voice. "That's very generous of you." Emily smiled warmly, and for a fleeting moment, Richard felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. Perhaps this young woman was indeed the compassionate person he had hoped for. As Emily turned back to Jake, Richard took a step back, watching them interact with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. "Wow, that was really sweet of you, Em," Jake remarked, bite-sized pieces of sandwich still lingering on his lips. Emily shrugged, her cheeks flushed with a hint of embarrassment. "It's just a sandwich, Jake. I couldn't let him go hungry." Richard felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. It was a glimmer of hope, a sliver of light breaking through the clouds of doubt that had shrouded his perception of Emily. Yet, as he watched them, he couldn't shake the lingering skepticism that gnawed at him. One act of kindness didn't erase the influence of wealth or the complexity of motives. He needed to see more, to understand how Emily behaved when she thought no one was watching. As the couple finished their picnic and began to pack up, Richard made a silent decision. He would follow them home. He wanted to observe how Emily treated others, how she navigated the world outside of their privileged bubble. Would she remain kind, or would the veneer of compassion fade in the presence of materialism? He trailed them at a distance, careful to stay hidden among the trees that lined the path. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Richard kept his pace slow, allowing them to lead the way. He watched as they strolled hand in hand, their laughter echoing in the cool evening air. When they reached an upscale apartment complex, Richard hesitated. The building was sleek and modern, a far cry from the life he had chosen for this experiment. He felt a pang of discomfort, but he pushed it aside. His mission was not yet complete. As they entered the building, Richard found a nearby bench to sit on, a strategic location where he could watch without being too conspicuous. He pulled the sandwich Emily had given him from his pocket, a strange token of the encounter, and took a small bite. The flavors were fresh, and for a moment he savored the taste, allowing it to remind him of the compassion he had just witnessed. Minutes turned into an hour as he waited, observing the comings and goings of the residents. He saw families returning from their day, their arms laden with grocery bags, and couples engaged in animated conversations. The world around him was bustling, a stark contrast to his own solitude. Finally, he spotted Emily leaving the building again, this time alone. She carried a large tote bag, and Richard's heart raced with curiosity. Where could she be going? He stood up, instinctively following her at a safe distance. Emily walked with purpose, her stride confident. Richard's mind raced with possibilities. Was she heading to a charity event? Did she volunteer regularly? Questions swirled in his head, and he was determined to find answers. After a few blocks, she arrived at a local community center. Richard watched as she entered, the door closing behind her. His heart pounded in his chest. He had stumbled upon a potential revelation. What was she doing here? He approached the center cautiously, peering through a window as he tried to remain unseen. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. A group of volunteers bustled around, preparing meals in a kitchen that gleamed with activity. Emily was right in the middle of it all, her hands deftly chopping vegetables and chatting with the other volunteers. From his vantage point, Richard could see her smile, her laughter blending seamlessly with the camaraderie of the crew. "Hey, Emily, you're a lifesaver for coming in tonight," one of the volunteers exclaimed. "I love it here. It's always so rewarding," Emily replied, her voice bright and full of enthusiasm. "We're expecting a large crowd tonight, so let's make sure we have enough food prepared." Richard felt a swell of emotion as he watched her interact with the others. She was not just kind to Jake. Her compassion extended to those in need, to those often overlooked. It was a side of Emily that he had never anticipated, one that challenged the assumptions he had made. Yet, even as he felt hope blossom within him, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Was this all an act? Could her kindness be a performance for the sake of appearances? Richard wrestled with the complexity of his feelings, torn between admiration and skepticism. As the evening wore on, the community center filled with people seeking warmth and a meal. Emily moved among them, distributing plates and engaging in conversations, her genuine care evident in every interaction. Richard's heart ached with a mix of pride for Jake and uncertainty about Emily's true intentions. He remained outside, watching the scene unfold, knowing that he was on the cusp of discovering something profound about the woman who had captured his son's heart. But he also understood that one night of kindness did not equate to a lifetime of integrity. The question remained, could he trust her, or was he witnessing a carefully curated facade? With each passing moment, Richard felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had set out to test Emily's character, yet the more he learned, the more he questioned his own motives. What if, in the pursuit of uncovering the truth, he lost something precious, a chance at understanding, a chance at acceptance? As he pondered these thoughts, he realized that the journey was far from over. He would need to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of Emily's character. The true test lay ahead, and Richard was determined to uncover the reality behind the woman who had captured Jake's heart. Richard, still disguised as Charlie, found himself standing outside the local shelter, his heart racing in anticipation and anxiety. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden hue over the city. He watched as people shuffled in and out, some with weary faces, others brightened by the prospect of a warm meal and friendly conversation. Today was different. Today he would witness Emily in her element. As he stepped inside, the aroma of simmering stew and fresh bread enveloped him. The spacious room was filled with long wooden tables, each surrounded by individuals seeking comfort and sustenance. Richard noticed Emily immediately. Dressed in a casual yet stylish outfit, she moved gracefully among the tables, her smile radiant as she interacted with the patrons. The sight of her in this context was both heartwarming and surreal to Richard. "Here you go, sir. Just a little bit of everything," Emily said cheerfully, placing a steaming bowl in front of an elderly man who had trouble holding his spoon. "I hope you like it." "Bless you, dear," he responded, his face lighting up at her kindness. Richard felt a familiar tug at his heartstrings, a mix of admiration and apprehension. Was this the same woman who had been so enamored with his son's wealth? Or was there a deeper layer to her character that he had yet to uncover? As Emily moved on to the next table, Richard decided to observe her without interruption. He leaned against the wall, half hidden in the shadows, watching as she chatted easily with the guests, asking them about their lives, their dreams, and their struggles. Each word seemed to come from a place of genuine concern, and Richard couldn't help but feel his resolve wavering. Perhaps he had misjudged her. "Do you want any more bread, Mrs. Johnson?" Emily asked a woman who had just spilled some soup on her lap. "Oh dear, I wouldn't want to be a bother," the woman replied, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Nonsense! You deserve to enjoy your meal just like everyone else," Emily insisted, her voice firm yet friendly. Richard marveled at her ability to uplift spirits, to genuinely care for those around her. He could see the warmth in her eyes, the sincerity of her actions. This was not the gold-digging opportunist he had feared, but a young woman with a heart full of compassion. Just then, Richard's attention was drawn to a nearby table where a group of younger volunteers were chatting. He strained to hear what they were saying, half expecting to catch some gossip or negative comments about the clientele. Instead, he heard Emily's voice again. "I sometimes worry, about Jake and the lifestyle we lead. I love him, but sometimes I feel like I'm just a trophy to his family," she confided to her friend Sarah, her tone shifting from cheerful to contemplative. Richard's breath caught in his throat. "A trophy," he whispered under his breath, the phrase echoing in his mind. He had always feared that his wealth would color his son's relationships, and here was Emily, a girl he had initially deemed superficial, revealing her own insecurities. She didn't want to be seen as just another accessory to Jake's affluent lifestyle. "Emily, you're not a trophy. Jake loves you for you," Sarah replied, her voice filled with concern. "You have to know that." "I hope so," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want to be with someone who only sees me as a reflection of his wealth. Sometimes I wonder if he'd still love me if I didn't have money to spend or fancy places to go." Richard's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had underestimated Emily's depth. Here was a woman grappling with her own fears and doubts, trying to navigate a world that often placed value on wealth over character. It was a perspective he hadn't anticipated, and it made him question his own motives for testing her. As the evening wore on, Richard continued to observe Emily from a distance, his earlier skepticism giving way to a burgeoning respect. She moved through the shelter like a breath of fresh air, spreading joy and warmth. But despite that, he found himself wrestling with an internal conflict. Could he really trust her? Was this kindness genuine, or merely an act put on for show? After the dinner service ended, Richard watched as Emily helped clean up, her laughter ringing through the hall as she exchanged playful banter with the other volunteers. Suddenly, a feeling of guilt washed over him. Here he was, a man hiding behind a facade, watching her every move without her knowledge. He had come to see if she was worthy of his son's love, but what of his own integrity? Later that night, Richard found himself wandering the streets, lost in thought. The sky was a deep indigo, speckled with stars, yet he felt an unsettling weight in his heart. He sat down on a park bench, the chill of the night air creeping in as he reflected on the day's events. "Why am I doing this?" he murmured to himself. "Am I protecting my son or just playing God?" Frustration bubbled within him as he clenched his fists. The lines he had drawn in the sand were beginning to blur. The test he had devised felt more like a betrayal than an investigation into Emily's character. As the park grew quieter, Richard's thoughts turned back to Emily's confessions. Her vulnerability resonated with him, and he felt an urge to confront her about what he had overheard. But how could he do that? How could he reveal his identity and the truth behind his actions without causing irreparable harm? His internal turmoil continued until he finally decided to head home. The mansion he had once taken solace in now felt like a cage, trapping him in his own wealth and expectations. He knew he needed to find a way to resolve this mess, but the path forward remained shrouded in uncertainty. That night, as Richard lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, replaying Emily's laughter and the genuine warmth she exuded. He realized that he had been blinded by his own fears and prejudices. Was it possible that Emily, the girl he had so harshly judged, was indeed worthy of Jake's love? As dawn broke, illuminating his opulent surroundings, Richard sat up with a newfound determination. He had to gather more evidence, not to confirm his suspicions, but to truly understand the woman his son loved. The next steps were critical. He needed to see her in different circumstances, to learn more about her life outside the shelter. Perhaps then he could finally reconcile the image he had constructed with the reality he had witnessed. With that thought, Richard resolved to continue his charade as Charlie, but with a different intention. No longer would he simply be an observer. He would engage with Emily, learn from her, and perhaps in the process discover more about himself. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The lines between right and wrong, between wealth and character, were far more complex than he had ever imagined. Richard, still under the guise of Charlie, had become a familiar face in the park. Day after day, he watched as Emily and Jake continued their routine, unaware of the scrutiny under which they stood. Richard had initially planned to observe Emily's kindness through a veil of anonymity, but as the days turned into weeks, he found himself developing a connection to her, one he had never anticipated. On a particularly warm afternoon, Richard sat on a park bench, his weathered hands gripping a crumpled coffee cup as he feigned sipping from it. He watched with a mixture of admiration and trepidation as Emily approached, her golden hair catching the sunlight. She was carrying a small brown bag, and Richard's heart raced as he wondered what she might have brought. "Hey, Charlie!" she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. "I thought you might be hungry." Richard blinked, taken aback by her familiarity. She extended the bag toward him, and Richard could see that it contained a sandwich, some fruit, and a small bottle of water. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt monumental. "Thank you," he replied, his voice gravelly and filled with emotion. He took the bag, his fingers brushing against hers, and he noticed the warmth of her touch. Emily settled down on the bench next to him, her demeanor relaxed. "I see you here quite often. Do you come to the park every day?" Richard chuckled softly, trying to maintain his facade. "Most days. It's peaceful here." "It really is," she agreed, glancing out at the children playing in the distance. "I love coming here to unwind. The city can be overwhelming sometimes. I think it's important to find moments of peace." Richard watched her as she spoke, captivated by her passion and sincerity. "What do you do when you're not here?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I'm a student, actually. I'm studying environmental science," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I want to make a difference, help combat climate change. I believe we can do better for our planet." Richard nodded, impressed. Her aspirations were noble, and he felt a pang of guilt twist in his stomach. Here she was, sharing her dreams with him, and he was nothing more than a facade, a pawn in his own game of deception. "You sound like you have a plan," he said, forcing a smile to mask his internal conflict. "I try," she replied, her expression turning contemplative. "But it's not always easy. Sometimes I worry that my background will overshadow my ambitions. Jake's family is, well, they have a lot of influence. I don't want to be seen as just another pretty face." Richard's heart ached. He could sense her vulnerability, the weight of her insecurities, and it struck him that she was more than just the girl he had initially doubted. She was real, and she was struggling with her identity in a world that seemed to value wealth over character. "Don't sell yourself short," he said softly, his voice unexpectedly reassuring. "You have a voice, and it matters. Just keep speaking up for what you believe in." Emily smiled at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Charlie. That means a lot. Sometimes it feels like no one believes in me." Richard felt a surge of emotion as he listened to her. He was being pulled deeper into this charade, and the lines between his true identity and Charlie's began to blur. This was not just a test. This was a connection, and it was growing stronger by the day. As the weeks went by, Richard found himself looking forward to these conversations. Emily would come to the park, often bringing food, and they would discuss everything from environmental issues to her favorite books. She was bright, funny, and engaging, and Richard began to see her as a daughter figure rather than just a test subject. One day, as they sat on the bench sharing a sandwich, Emily's expression turned serious. "Charlie, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, a sense of foreboding settling in. "Why are you out here?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "I mean, I know you say it's peaceful, but there must be more to it. You don't seem like you belong here." Richard hesitated, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of her gaze, dissecting him, probing for the truth beneath his disguise. "I've had a tough time," he finally admitted, choosing his words carefully. "Lost my job and my place, just trying to find my way back." "I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly, her features softening with empathy. "If you ever need help or resources, I can connect you with people at the shelter. They're wonderful there." Richard nodded, touched by her kindness. "Thank you, Emily. That means a lot. But I'm managing for now." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, Emily suddenly brightened. "You know, we're having a community event next week. I'd love for you to come. It's a charity fundraiser for the local homeless shelter." Richard felt a jolt of panic. He had been careful to stay in the shadows, but now she was inviting him into her world, a world where his deception could unravel in an instant. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he stammered, trying to deflect. "Why not?" she pressed, her eyes wide with excitement. "I think it would be good for you to meet some people, make connections. Plus, it'll be fun. You should come." Richard's heart sank. He could see the sincerity in her invitation, the genuine desire to include him. But how could he accept? The thought of attending an event as Charlie, knowing he was living a lie, filled him with guilt. "I'll think about it," he said finally, hoping to buy himself more time. Over the next few days, the invitation hung over his head like a storm cloud. He had grown fond of Emily, and the thought of disappointing her gnawed at his conscience. Yet, revealing his true identity felt like a betrayal, not only to her, but to everything he had come to learn about her character. As the date of the event approached, Richard found himself consumed by conflicting emotions. His heart longed to connect with Emily and embrace her world. Still, the weight of his deception threatened to crush him. On the day of the event, Richard paced in his small, makeshift home, which consisted of a few discarded boxes and an old blanket. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He could hear laughter and music in the distance, the sounds of celebration that seemed to mock his internal struggle. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. Should he go? Should he reveal himself? As he contemplated his next move, he heard a familiar voice calling out, "Charlie!" Emily's voice pierced through the noise, and Richard's heart skipped a beat. He peered out from behind a tree, and there she was, looking radiant in a flowing dress, her smile illuminating the evening. "Charlie, I'm so glad I found you," she exclaimed, rushing toward him. "I really want you to come to the event. It wouldn't be the same without you." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The light in her eyes was so genuine, so full of hope. She was offering him a chance to be part of something bigger, to step out from the shadows and into the light. But as he looked at her, the weight of his deception bore down on him. He could feel the truth of who he was pressing against his chest, a truth that threatened to spill out at any moment. "Emily, he began, but the words tangled in his throat. "Please, just come," she urged, her voice filled with sincerity. "I want you to meet my friends. I want them to see how amazing you are." Richard's heart shattered at her words. She believed in him, and yet here he stood, a hollow man cloaked in lies. "Okay," he finally said, the decision hanging heavy in the air. "I'll be there." As he watched her face light up with joy, he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He was stepping into her world, but at what cost? The truth loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to overshadow the connection they had formed. "Great! I'll see you there," Emily beamed, turning to leave, her excitement palpable. Richard watched her walk away, a mix of pride and dread swirling within him. He had agreed to join her for the event, but he knew that the truth could no longer remain buried. As he prepared to face the world, he realized that the time for honesty was fast approaching. With a heavy heart, Richard made his way to the charity event, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say when the moment of truth finally arrived. The evening air was thick with anticipation, and Richard felt the weight of his decision bearing down on him. Richard, still cloaked in the guise of Charlie, stepped into the vibrant atmosphere of the community event. Colorful banners adorned the park, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. As he navigated through the crowd, the warmth of the summer evening wrapped around him, contrasting with the chill of uncertainty in his heart. He had watched Emily interact with others before, but this was different. He was witnessing her in her element, surrounded by friends and acquaintances, exuding a natural charm that captivated everyone around her. Emily was a beacon of light in the gathering, her face animated as she shared stories and laughed with a group of children. Richard marveled at her ease, noting how she knelt down to their level, her eyes sparkling with genuine interest. "You all did such a great job with your art projects. I'm so proud of you," she exclaimed, her voice melodic and inviting. The children beamed with pride, their small hands clutching crayon-drawn masterpieces. Richard felt a pang of admiration mixed with regret. The connection he had forged with Emily over the past weeks had been unexpected. He had come to appreciate her kindness and her ability to make even the smallest moments feel significant. Yet, each passing interaction felt like a thread pulling tighter, binding him in a web of deception he had spun himself. He stood at the periphery, watching, his heart heavy with the weight of his secret. "Charlie, you made it!" Emily's voice cut through his reverie as she spotted him across the park. She rushed over, her face lighting up with delight. "I'm so glad you're here. Come meet some of my friends." Without waiting for his response, she grabbed his hand, pulling him into the throng of people. As they approached a small group, Richard felt his heart race. He was acutely aware of the contrast between his current persona and the life he had built as Richard, the wealthy businessman. "Everyone, this is Charlie. He's been a great help at the shelter," she introduced, her enthusiasm palpable. The group greeted him with smiles and friendly nods, making him feel oddly accepted, even loved, for who he was pretending to be. "Hey, Charlie! What do you think of our community event?" asked a tall man with a baseball cap, extending his hand for a shake. "It's wonderful," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "I've seen a lot of hard work go into this. It's inspiring." Emily's eyes sparkled with pride. "Isn't it? Everyone worked so hard to put this together. It's great to see the community come together like this." She turned to her friends, her energy infectious. "Charlie has been such a big part of making it happen." Richard felt his heart swell at her words, even as guilt gnawed at him. He had come to learn so much about Emily, yet he still held back the most crucial piece of information: his true identity. The evening wore on, filled with laughter, games and impromptu performances, and Richard found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He watched as Emily interacted with her friends, her kindness radiating and leaving an impact on everyone around her. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the park, Jake arrived, his presence shifting the atmosphere. He was met with enthusiastic greetings from his friends, and Richard observed as Jake's eyes landed on Emily. "Hey, babe!" he called, striding over with a wide smile that illuminated his face. "Jake, you made it!" Emily exclaimed, rushing into his arms. Richard's heart sank slightly at the sight of their affection, the way they fit together so effortlessly. He felt like an intruder, an outsider peering into a world he was not meant to inhabit. As Jake introduced Emily to his friends, Richard found himself standing back, a silent witness to the affection shared between them. "This is Emily, the girl I've told you all about," Jake said, his voice brimming with pride. "She's amazing, isn't she?" "Absolutely," one of Jake's friends chimed in. "We've heard so much about you. Jake can't stop talking about how incredible you are." Richard could see the glow on Emily's face as she basked in the compliments. She smiled demurely, yet there was a spark of confidence in her eyes. "Thank you. It's great to finally meet all of you," she replied, her voice warm and inviting. In that moment, Richard felt a profound sense of pride for Emily. She was everything he had hoped for his son, a kind-hearted, genuine person who brought joy to those around her. Yet the more he observed, the more conflicted he became. He had set out to test her character, to ensure she was worthy of Jake's love, but now he was questioning the very foundation of his own judgment. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself pulled between admiration and guilt. He had come to care for Emily, not just as a test subject, but as a person with dreams, fears, and aspirations. Each laughter shared, each story exchanged, felt like a thread weaving a tapestry of connection that he was about to unravel with his truth. "Charlie, you should tell them about your experiences at the shelter," Emily suggested, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I think they'd love to hear your story." Richard hesitated, the weight of her suggestion hanging heavily in the air. "Oh, I don't know. I'm just a guy who's been through a lot." "It's not that interesting," he deflected, hoping to avoid the spotlight. "Nonsense. Your story is important," she insisted, her expression earnest. "Everyone has a story, and yours could inspire someone." Jake and his friends leaned in, their curiosity piqued. "Come on, man. We want to hear it," Jake encouraged, a wide smile on his face. Richard felt the pressure build. He could either step forward and share a piece of himself, or he could remain hidden in the shadows of Charlie. The realization hit him hard. He had built a connection with Emily based on a lie, and now he stood on the precipice of revealing his true self. As the laughter and chatter surrounded him, he felt the urge to speak up, to share the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface. But the fear of what that revelation might do to his relationship with Emily and with Jake held him back. What if she felt betrayed? What if Jake's trust in him shattered? The evening continued, but Richard felt a sense of urgency growing within him. The moment to reveal his identity was approaching, yet each passing second felt heavier than the last. He looked at Emily, laughing and engaging with Jake, and his heart twisted. The woman he had come to admire was standing there, oblivious to the storm brewing within him. As the stars began to twinkle above, casting a soft glow over the park, Richard knew he had to make a decision. He could either continue to live this lie or step into the light, revealing himself and risking everything. But fear held him captive, and as the laughter echoed around him, he hesitated, torn between the truth and the bonds he had forged. Richard, still cloaked in his guise as Charlie, lingered near the park's fountain, the sound of splashing water barely calming the tempest brewing inside him. He had spent weeks observing Emily, trying to peel back the layers of her character, and yet he felt more confused than ever about her intentions. Just as he had gathered the courage to reveal his true self, he caught sight of Emily standing under a sprawling oak tree, her voice rising above the chatter of the park. "I just don't see how I can stay with him much longer," Emily said, her tone heavy with frustration. She was on the phone, her back turned to Richard, and he could just make out the silhouette of her friend, Lisa, who leaned against the rough bark, her arms crossed. "Jake is sweet and all, but he's so dependent on his family's wealth. I can't handle it. What if I fall in love with him for the wrong reasons?" Emily continued, her voice laced with uncertainty. Richard's heart sank at her words. Was this the woman he had admired for her kindness? The woman who had shown compassion to him, a stranger on the street? "Emily, you love him, don't you?" Lisa replied, her voice soothing, yet probing. "I thought I did, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm just another trophy for his family. I don't want to be that," Emily confessed, her voice cracking slightly. Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he processed her words. Could it be that Emily was simply using Jake for his status? Was she genuinely concerned about their relationship, or was this a calculated decision? Richard's mind raced as the implications of her conversation settled like a weight on his chest. He had come to believe that Emily was sincere, that she possessed a goodness that transcended material wealth. But now, this revelation cast a shadow over everything he had witnessed. He leaned against the fountain, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge. A part of him wanted to confront her immediately, to demand the truth about her feelings for Jake. But fear held him back, fear of what he might discover. As he mulled over his next move, Richard noticed Emily's expression shift as she continued her conversation. "I feel like I need to escape this world of money and privilege. It suffocates me," she said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Richard's heart raced. The girl he had come to see as a beacon of hope now felt trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. "Maybe you should talk to Jake," Lisa suggested. "He may surprise you." "Maybe," Emily replied, uncertainty clouding her features. "But if I'm honest with him, I'm afraid he'll think I'm just another gold digger." With that, she hung up the phone, and Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard enough. In that moment of turmoil, Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He had come to know Emily, and while he felt betrayed, he also sensed a deeper truth within her that deserved to be confronted. He stepped forward, his voice hoarse but steady. "Emily." She turned, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Charlie," she exclaimed, confusion etched on her face. "What are you doing here?" Richard swallowed hard, the weight of his deception crashing down on him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his heart racing. "It's important." "What's going on?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "You look different." "Different because I'm not who you think I am," Richard replied, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm not just some homeless man. My name is Richard, and I'm Jake's father." The revelation hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Emily's expression shifted from confusion to shock, her mouth agape as she tried to process the information. You're Jake's father?" she stammered, disbelief evident in her wide eyes. "Yes," he said, taking a step closer. "And I've been watching you, watching how you treat people, how you treat my son. I thought I was protecting him, but now I don't know what to think anymore." "Richard, Emily began, but he interrupted her. "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "I heard what you said to your friend. You're considering leaving Jake because of his wealth. Is that true?" Her gaze fell to the ground, shame washing over her features. "I didn't mean for you to hear that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then tell me it's not true," he urged, desperation flooding his tone. "Tell me you care about him for who he is, not what he has." Emily looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do care about him, Richard, but it's complicated. I'm scared that if I commit to him, I'll lose myself in the process. His world feels so foreign to me." Richard's heart sank further as he listened to her struggles. "But you have to understand, Emily. Jake loves you. He sees you for who you are, not for what you bring to the table. You'd be making a mistake to walk away." Just then, Richard heard hurried footsteps approaching. He turned to see Jake rounding the corner, a bright smile on his face that faded into confusion as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on?" he asked, concern flooding his features as he noticed the tension in the air. Richard felt a rush of panic. He had intended to confront Emily privately, but now Jake's presence complicated everything. "Jake, Richard started, but Emily interjected. "Jake, I was just talking to Charlie," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We were discussing some things." Jake raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "Things? What kind of things?" he pressed, looking back and forth between them. "Things about your relationship," Richard said, feeling the weight of his confession. "Emily was just telling me how she feels about your wealth." Jake's face paled, and the atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "What did she say?" Richard felt caught in the crossfire. "I think it's better if Emily explains," he said, aware that the truth could shatter the fragile bond between them. Emily took a deep breath, her courage wavering under Jake's intense gaze. "Jake, she started, her voice quivering. "I've been feeling lost in your world. I love you, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just another person in your life because of your family's money." Jake's expression twisted into one of hurt and disbelief. "Emily, I thought we were past this. I love you for you, not for your status or anything else." Richard watched the scene unfold, his heart aching for both of them. The truth, while necessary, felt like a knife cutting through the fabric of their relationship. He had wanted to protect his son, but now he feared he had only exacerbated the situation. Emily looked at Jake, pain etched across her features. "I know you do, but I'm scared. I don't want to be seen as a gold digger or someone who's only here for your money. I need to know if you love me for who I am." Jake's eyes narrowed, and Richard could see the turmoil churning within him. "You're not a gold digger, Emily. You're everything to me. But if you're doubting that, then maybe we do need to talk." The tension hung thick in the air, Richard's heart racing as he realized he had set off a chain of events that could not be undone. In that moment, he felt the weight of his actions and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He had sought to test Emily's character, but in doing so, he had put everything at risk. As Jake looked between Richard and Emily, his entire world seemed to hang in the balance. The future of their relationships now lay precariously at the edge of a precipice, waiting for someone to take a leap of faith. Richard's heart pounded with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning.